How many people here know how to create change within yourself, within your families, and within your communities? Raise your hand. There's a few, but not many. The reason I start with that question is because the one thing that we will all need to do and continue to do is we need to know how to create change, and hopefully positive change. But when you think about it, that's one of the things that we hardly ever talk about in education. We learn facts, we learn figures, we learn methods, we learn tools, but really we don't really learn what it means to create change. So I'm obsessed with that question. It sort of grabbed a hold of me many years ago, and I'm going to tell you and share with you some discoveries I've made along the way. So about 15 years ago, I was working at the University of Michigan. I was a graduate student, and I was studying how students become leaders and change agents. There's lots of higher education institutes who work to educate students in that way, but there wasn't anybody really studying what that process looks like. And I had the privilege of working with a professional school, one of the top professional schools in the world, and they actually had a reputation for creating these leaders and change agents. And so I really wanted to know what happens inside of the students when they go from, I want to know how to create change, to actually being able to do so. And so in this school, they had what's called a really wonderful action-based curriculum. The students spent time every week in academic courses, but then 10 to 20 hours a week in field experiences out in the community, in some organization that was working to create change. And so the first thing I did was I wanted to go and observe the students in the classroom. And what I saw was students looking like they were on fire, like all kinds of epiphanies, all kinds of awakenings. You could see those light bulbs just popping along. And they were learning concepts and methods that really fundamentally challenged the way they saw themselves and their role in the world. And they seemed to be taking it in. Because any classroom I went and witnessed, the students were literally like alive. I rarely saw the professors talking. And so then I went and talked to the faculty, and I was like, how do you think they're doing? How does this happen? Do you have evidence of their learning? Yep, they could show evidence. And their field instructors, some of them had been teaching the students for over 20 years, would say, I don't know what y'all are doing at that school, but whatever it is, keep it up, because they're amazing. And they would show me the things that they were doing in their communities to create change. So I was really excited to go talk to the students. And so at the end of that first year, I did focus groups with 120 students. And the first question I asked was, all right, what are you learning? What are the most important things you've learned in this last year that really help you do this change business? And what I was met with was pretty much blank stares. Like, huh? I was like, yeah, what are the most important things you're learning? And they're like, oh, we're learning a lot about diversity. Good, great. What about diversity? They couldn't tell me. I'm like, okay. So what else are you learning? Oh, we're learning that, change can be hard. Okay, say more. And they really couldn't say more. It was like pulling teeth. It was completely different than what I had witnessed. I said, okay, so how are you doing in terms of becoming this leader and changing? What is that like for you? Do you identify as that? And overwhelmingly, they were like, nope, I don't see myself that way. And so what I was experiencing was this incredible disconnection between how they were perceived and what I saw and their understanding of their own learning. They couldn't identify as a leader or change agent, and nor could they tell me what they were learning. And when I pushed harder to say, well, what is this that's happening? What I came upon was this fragmentation. And what they said to me is like, we have all these transformative moments. We have all these epiphanies, but we have no way to put it together. So what I learned was that transformation without integration was fragmentation. And so in the next phase of research, I set out to understand and to help them integrate their learning. And so what I designed was this one-credit course where we were going to experiment with different ways of doing this. But there was two problems. Number one is that nobody had ever done this before, not integration in the way that we were thinking about it. And number two, I was really, really, really sick. I had lupus. And I had Crohn's disease. And I had gone through 4 miscarriages, and I could barely get out of bed most days. In fact, the only thing I was doing at that time was dragging myself to campus once a week so I could try to facilitate this integrative course, which I really didn't know anything how to do. And so about 6 weeks into the course, I noticed something. I noticed that sometimes after class, I felt great. And even for a few minutes, I almost forgot like I was sick. And at other times after class, I felt awful. I could barely breathe, I could barely walk, and I could hardly get to my car. And back in those days, within a 3-month period, I went to the emergency room at least 11 times. I was really sick. But it occurred to me to think, I wonder if something's happening in the classroom that I'm not noticing, that sometimes I'm getting better and sometimes not. I don't know. So I began to pay attention. And what I noticed was pretty exciting. So what I noticed is that when students would talk about their experiences, because that was the purpose of the class, to come together, talk about what they were learning in the field, and sort of connect and sort of, reflect and write things down. When students would talk in this very surface way, right? We've all had boring classroom discussions, right? When they would talk in that surface way, the inflammation and the pain in my body would go up. And if I got them to talk in this, what I call this embodied way, a way where they would really talk about their experiences, like in first person, like I was in my field experiences and suddenly I was working with this woman who had just learned that her son had autism and she was freaking, they would speak in detail. And they didn't even have to be positive experiences, but when they would speak with this detail, I suddenly would feel so much better. And if we did that for the full 2 hours, by the end of class, I would leave and I would feel better than I'd felt all week. And so I began to really look into what is this phenomenon? What is happening here? And that's when I discovered the following. That one of the things that's been going on for like 50 years, actually people have known about this for 50 years, but we haven't talked about it in higher ed, is this thing called disembodied knowledge and these other forms of knowledge, right? What was happening when students would talk and they would share their experience in this really alive way is they were connecting to their embodied knowledge. Embodied knowledge is the knowledge that we gain from our life experience. Turns out it's what drives us. It's what drives and motivates our decisions and actions most of the time. But what we deal with in higher ed most of the time is disembodied knowledge, right? Facts, figures, definitions. And so what happens is that when we're in disembodied realm, is that the learning often becomes rote, it can get boring, and we leave classes not knowing what we know. And so I discovered, okay, we need to actually get at this embodied knowledge. And so what I began to do was basically learn to ask much better questions, right? So remember those focus groups I did? Part of the reason that they were pretty awful was because I was asking the wrong questions. Instead of asking, what did you learn or what was important to you, I needed to ask an embodied question, which is, tell me about a time when you're sitting in a classroom and all of a sudden, boom, you're engaged and you're alive and you heard something that really stuck with you. Or tell me about a time in your field site or in your class where you felt really challenged or frustrated and then you worked through it and you got to the other side. Because it turns out where learning happens is in those challenges and in those frustrations and in those aha moments that happen unconsciously. And so as I got into this embodied questions and they got into it, our class became a lot more fun, a lot more interesting. And I would say we became more interesting people because we were always then sort of speaking from the authentic experiences of what was going on. But I also had the sense, and they suddenly became able to say, oh yeah, this is what I'm learning in the program, and they became much more excited about the program, so which is great. So integration's happening, everyone's happy, but I had a sense that there was more. And so I decided to experiment. And so one day I went to class and I said, okay, today what we're going to do is we're going to do things in threes. So I had students I had a student stand in front of me and have her tell me 3 experiences in a row of times where she was struggling or frustrated or challenged in some way in her field experience in the classroom, and then she worked through it, right? That's one of those embodied questions. She gave this embodied answer. And somewhere along the beginning of her 3rd story, something amazing started happening. Is that I suddenly felt this joy bomb come crawling up inside of me, and all of a sudden it hit me with unbelievable clarity and peace, and then suddenly I heard these words like master of complexity and all these things sort of running through me, and I'd hurry and write them down. I intuitively knew that what I was hearing were her strengths that she hadn't even said in the story. And so when she was done, I would say, well, let me tell you what I just heard. And I looked down at the little piece of paper where I'd scratched these notes, and I started to feed them back to her. And before I could get into the second sentence, everybody else who was listening in, 12 other people, jumped in and they started saying the same thing. So wait a minute, what just happened here? A whole room full of people just heard and felt the same thing that was never ever spoken. Think about that. Is it because we're psychic? No. It's because what we heard and what we felt was literally the truth of the matter, the truth of her matter, the truth of the thing that I next discovered. The thing that I next discovered was inside of this embodied knowledge, we have all these habits, right? We have practical knowledge like how to ride a bike. But what we also have is what I call generative knowledge. And generative knowledge is the knowledge that we need in order to feel purposeful and to know what our strengths are and to know what I call our superpowers, right? So inside of there is this template, what I call a fundamental wholeness, a living template, and that when it's activated, we literally become, in some ways, entirely different people. We have capacities and intelligence that we literally did not know that we had. And so as we did this in the classroom, that first day, instead of going 2 hours that day, we went 4 hours. Because after we saw what happened to her, we're all like, oh, me next, right? And even I had them unpack me that day because I wanted to know what my strengths and what my superpowers were, because I didn't know either. And as I worked with those students, I developed a method called the Integrative Knowledge Portfolio Process and Generative Dialogue. And it's these methods that pull out these superpowers, these capacities, and our purpose so that we can use them more intentionally. And when the students did that process, in under a semester, they went from not knowing who they were or what they wanted to do to being able to say, this is who I am, this is what I can do, and this is how I make a difference. So that was great. And so what I spent the next couple of years doing is continuing to hone this method because I started to understand that it wasn't just strengths that we could find, but there was more. And so the first thing that I found after the strength was a purpose. So I'm going to give you a little hint. If you want to go around and if you're wondering what your purpose is, if you want to help other people find their purpose, then here's a little exercise you can do with your friends. Is share with each other 3 times in a row somebody who's motivated and inspired you in some way. And while you're listening to each other, make sure that you can get really clear examples. And if you listen deeply enough, you'll get that joy bomb. And that joy bomb, when it goes off, you'll hear that person's part of their purpose, what makes them whole and what makes them strong. And here's the most extraordinary thing of all. Lots of times people have been saying to me, give me the questions, give me these great embodied questions so I can uncover all these dimensions, my purpose, my strengths, and the big one, my change resources, right? So the change resources are the resources that you have, very specific set of resources that are internal and external that you need in order to create change in your life. So I can write a self-help book based on mine, but that's not going to help you because yours are different than mine. What we can do is we can unleash these resources in each other. And what happens when we don't know what these resources are is that a lot of us go around hating ourselves because I don't know about you, but there's been plenty of things in my life that I wish I could change and I didn't know how to change them. And the reason for that is because I had no idea what my change resources were. So the important thing that I've learned here is that we can never do this process alone. So I now know kind of like the keys to the kingdom. I have all the great embodied questions to get at all these different dimensions, but I absolutely need my friends. Like when I get stuck, I call them up and say, hey, can you do the thing with me? And they're like, yeah, we can do the thing with you. Because in order to hear that embodied knowledge, we need other people to unpack us and fluff us out. So fluff you out is a very much a technical term, okay? Okay. So fast forward 8 years, and then I had the pleasure of being invited here to UCO. And I actually consider quite an honor to be considered a member of your community. And I began working with several groups here on campus, Black Male Initiative, the Hispanic Student Success Initiative, Stellar, and Gear Up. And what I've discovered is that the extraordinary changes that were happening with students at Michigan have happened at many other institutions, but the way that they happen here is like nowhere else on earth. And that's because it's not just that they learned this method that I have provided, but more importantly, that what you've taught me is that what you need to really set students on fire and really create incredible leaders and change agents is what I call a beloved community. And UCO has that. I've worked with dozens of institutions, and I've never seen beloved community like I've seen it here. So as I was working, for instance, with the Hispanic Student Success Initiative, they went from, they were working with groups of students that nationwide has about a 50% what's called a retention rate or continuation rate from year 1 to year 2 in college. And when the Hispanic Student Success Initiative worked with students as a pilot and used this method, they got that all the way up to 90%. I just want to say, in the history of higher education, that's never happened before. And the reason that happened wasn't just the magic of the method, it was also the magic of the place. The last little story I'll share is that a couple weeks ago, my friend Karen was really sick. She'd been sick since Christmas. She'd been sick like 3 or 4 weeks. And so I went over there, I took her some turkey soup, and I was like, she wanted to know more about my work. She wanted to know about these methods. And I said, how about instead of telling you about them, I demonstrate? She's like, okay. And I was like, all right. So tell me about someone who's motivated, inspired you in some way. Oh no, before I said this, I said on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is like you feel great and 10 is like you can't get out of bed, where would you put yourself right now? And she said, I put myself at a 7. Okay. So I did this thing where, tell me about someone that's motivated, inspired you. And she tells me 1. I make sure that I get that clear mental picture, and she gives me examples. And then 2, and then 3. And of course, right around 3, I get that joy bomb because now I expect it. And I say to her, well, what I heard was that you are actually really driven by overcoming these obstacles. I tell her what I heard in her superpowers. And she's like, that's amazing. I was like, yeah. So now on a scale of 1 to 10, how do you feel now? And she's like, oh my God, that's magic. I feel like it's a 3. And I was like, honey, that's not my magic. That's your wholeness. Thank you.